So just to start out, I'm Catherine. I'm from Duke University, and I'm actually in the Management and Organizations department doing my PhD. When you look at my research, you're going to probably see a social psychologist, and you're also going to see a lot of sociological things. I've been spending a lot of time in the social department at Duke as well, and today I'm in a communications group, so I'm trying to cover a lot of ground here, so feel free to interrupt and ask questions as we go along if something isn't making a lot of sense to you. And so I just want to acknowledge my co-author on this work. It's Grania Fitzsimmons, who's also my dissertation co-chair. So to start, I wanted to sort of pose my fundamental question to the group. And so asking us, how do we achieve our goals? So everyone in this room has some sort of goal that they're trying to achieve. But instead of sort of focusing on our goals, let's think about goals of, say, 2 interns that are new to an organization. So we have them up here, and we look at them and say, what are you trying to achieve in your internship as a new associate at this organization? This person might say, I want a promotion. This person says, I want to have a strong relationship with my work team. Very typical goals that people will have in organizations. And so traditionally, when we think about achieving these goals and how we're going to get from point A to point B, we'll say things like, you know, I worked really long hours to achieve my goal. Something sort of, I'm conscientious, making this internal attribution a personality trait. Or they'll say, I'm a good team player. And these are ways that people would explain in terms of achieving these types of goals. And so what I'm going to say is that this is the traditional story. And this is the way in social psychology that we tend to look at achieving goals. I have some sort of outcome I want to achieve. I want to get a promotion, have a stronger relationship. And so I struggle with my social environment, and I overcome things by developing willpower and acting self-control and whatnot. So today I actually want to tell the other half, or a new story about how people achieve their goals, and in particular, a social network route to achieving people's goals. And so you look at these 2 goals of getting a promotion and developing a strong work team, and you have to think, well, how are we going to use these things to actually predict social network structure? And so I'll start with a really simple example and a question to ask ourselves over time. So you say, who do they invite to lunch? And so you think about inviting people to lunch not just one time, but sort of an aggregate of times and what this sort of function has for our network. So they're both new interns to the intern team. We can expect both of them will one day invite their interns team out to lunch. But what we predict and show in this research is that over time, sort of the pattern would happen looking like this. So this person would then go out to lunch with the secretaries. She'd continue to go out to lunch with her intern team. She'd go out to with the boss. She'd continue to go out with your intern team, and so on and so forth. And what we propose in this research is that this has network implications. So it's a very simple example of who do you invite out for lunch that we try to aggregate up throughout many interactions, many types of goals to shape social network structure. And so our overlying hypothesis is having these goals and motivations changes how our interpersonal approach and avoid tendencies with our social world. And this in turn shapes our networks. So networks that have been shown to have very important implications in terms of their structure and achieving promotions and social support. We believe that these goals in the first place are having us create networks as means to achieving these ends. So this is a very simplistic example, and I know you're all wondering the question, but I want both of these goals. I want a promotion, and I want a good relationship with my work team. And so we're going to go into more detail and let this get more complex as we go on throughout this talk. So just in terms of where we're going, we're going to do a quick lit review, talking about network antecedents and reverse causality. Then sort of the theoretical development. So how do we use these goals? How do we code them to predict network structure? And then I'm going to present 4 empirical studies. So the first 3 are experimental kind of lab-based studies that have their advantages of showing a mechanism, but they're easily criticized for being just sort of lab, small samples. So we try to tie them together in a 4th study where we have longitudinal networks data. And then finally, I'm going to have some implications in future research. So what we're really interested in this work is how do networks form? What are the antecedents? Where do networks come from? And so we pose this question that seems very simple to answer, but has a bit more complex complexities in terms of actually answering it. So I'm going to put up a quote that should look familiar to at least one person in the room. that I think does a really good job of summarizing the network's literature. So it says, network traditions demonstrate an unfortunate bias towards the consequences of network structure on attitudes and behavior, rather than on generating a better understanding of how and why people create, maintain, dissolve, and reconstitute network linkages. So this is something that's been echoed by a lot of people in the literature, both in communication, sociology, psychology, and organizational behavior. And what this basically says is that we haven't found this theoretical mechanism as to why we're reaching out and making links in our social world, telling a compelling story of sort of where our networks are coming from, what's generating them. We actually know what happens once we have them, but we don't really know in the first place what the antecedents are very clearly. And so the question is why this might be happening. And I think there have been a few assumptions about the agency of individuals that have sort of shaped how people have studied networks. And so it's been really encouraging to read Ron Burt's work throughout the past few decades. And I think he starts off in 1986 making a very strong statement about the agency of individuals. Basically, he says individuals don't matter. And so he talks a lot about entrepreneurs, that entrepreneurs aren't born with this entrepreneurial spirit, but rather entrepreneurs are a function of their network position. You're in the proper network position, all of a sudden you're going to become an entrepreneur, irregardless of your interpersonal or personal traits. Thank you. And then 25 years later, he starts lamenting this lack of attention on agency. And he says that not everyone who's sitting on a structural hole takes the opportunity and capitalizes on it. So he says, what's going on? There's something that we can't quite put our finger on. And he talks about motivation as being something that's happening. And in this talk, we're going to talk about goal motivation as one potential answer to this agency problem in social network structure. So just to quickly summarize, we have decades and decades of social network research. And this is very much established in the literature. So different aspects of structures lead to different sorts of things. And what my focus of my research, what did I just do, is this is my primary hypothesis, that people en route to trying to achieve these various things, like getting a promotion or getting social support, are creating networks as a means. So sort of the network is the mediating mechanism. And so these goals that people have that we're pursuing cause us to approach our environment in ways that build it up to hopefully link into this established literature that shows how network structure affects outcomes. And so now I'm going to sort of talk a bit more about how I propose this happens. So looking at how do goals, how do wanting a promotion or a good relationship with their work team influence network structure. So specifically in this section, how does this happen? So goals are something that we tend to think about as an individual activity. So if I run a marathon, I'm not crediting my significant other or my work team for my persisting through this race. But recent research has shown that there is, on top of this self-control process, this intrapsychic struggle of willpower, that there's something that has to do with relationships that is helping supplement and drive this process. So interpersonal processes are playing out as we're engaging in these personal processes. So just for starters, relationships prime goals. So what does this mean? Oh, sorry, pressing the wrong button. So here's a picture of my mom. And so everyone will think about their mom and what do moms want for their children in life? And so moms typically want their children to achieve. And so what we find is that when people who are primed with their moms and moms have this achievement orientation for their children, they tend to persist at their achievement tasks. So when I'm primed with my mother, by sort of having her picture on my desk or having her name subliminally flashed to me in an experiment, I'm going to persist longer at my achievement goals. And what we find is the opposite process occurs as well, but slightly differently. So when I'm primed with my goal of doing well academically, I'm going to activate people who are instrumental to this goal. So I'm not necessarily going to activate my mother because my mom is more giving me socio-emotional support. She's not editing my papers. So rather, when primed with this goal, I'm going to activate someone else. So this is actually Grania Fitzsimmons, who is of the Fitzsimmons and Barge citation there, and she's my advisor. And she's someone who definitely enables my academic goals. She helps me with my research, she edits my paper, and she also helps me with non-academic things that give me more time to do my academic endeavors. So she helps me with teaching so that I can focus on my research. And so what this is sort of saying is that when people have these goals active, you're activating people who facilitate these goals. And I think it hooks in well with Tanya's work on social capital activation. And so what we're essentially saying, although in different fields, is that when people have these goals active, they're activating people who enable the goals. What we're not talking about yet is how this has to do with structure. So we're saying that the content of people that you're activating are going to be goal relevant, but what about the structure of the people? How can we go from goals to some sort of structural outcome? So in order to do that, we decided to review the literature and create somewhat of a typology of goals. And so sort of asking the fundamental question of what do people strive to achieve? And so as you probably know, there's been many hierarchies of needs, lists of motivations, things that we're striving to accomplish. And a lot of these things have been proposed, but not all of them have been empirically tested. So we went directly to the cognitive goals literature to find different types of goals that have very discrete interpersonal outcomes when they are primed and active. So the first type of goal that we found were labeling self-oriented goals. And so oftentimes in the psych literature, these are broadly called achievement goals, but we think self-oriented goals does a better job of capturing what this is. And so these are goals that impact the self. So things like getting a promotion, or losing weight, or making more money, getting a new place to live. These are self-oriented goals. And what's really important with self-oriented goals is how people perceive their social networks when these goals are active. So what we find in the literature is that when people have these self-oriented goals, such as academic achievement or weight loss, we perceive people in our social world in terms of the skills that they have. So I look to people who can help me with my goals for very specific traits that people have. So I don't look to my mom who has this goal for me. I look to my advisors. I look to some of my colleagues in my graduate program to help me with my academic goals, very specific traits in other people. The other types of goals that have been studied and conceptualized are more affiliation-oriented goals. And so these are things such as building a better relationship with coworkers and romantic goals. And so these are goals that are, you do this by yourself, but there are these interpersonal outcomes that happen at the end of the road. And so what's important in terms of interpersonal perception for network implications is what happens when we have these goals active. How do we see people in our social networks? And so what we believe happens is this sort of rose-colored social perception. So a lot of times this is studied by priming a romantic goal and then getting online dating profiles that have been manipulated for levels of competence. And what we find is that, or what the research finds is that when you have these romantic goals primed, you don't see differences in competencies across people. So you're just unable to evaluate people in terms of traits and competencies. You're just looking for people to affiliate with generally. And so, yeah.
So is it possible that affiliation-oriented goals may be along the way towards self-oriented goals? In other words, how do you talk about the relationship between them?
This is perfect. So the next bullet point is that we're defining these both as end states, but both use interpersonal means. And we're just saying that sort of there are all these self-processes and goals that are overlaid with network processes, and that even though you're doing a self-oriented goal, it doesn't mean you're doing it by yourself. You're just using networks differently. And so we're proposing that how people evaluate social network connections is actually going to affect how they sort of network in their social world and how that filters up to affect social network status. So even though they're individualistic goals, they're still using social means, but just a different form of social networking interaction. Does that answer that? Yeah.
Well, to add to that, though, I mean, I think maybe this is where also not thinking is that the idea of affiliation is both in part a means to affiliate with perhaps like others, but it's also a means to kind of promote yourself in terms of who you are, with a kind of like blurry line.
Yeah. So in study 4, we use an MBA sample. And so they're the perfect example of people who affiliate to achieve. So you come to not a PhD program, an MBA program to network. And we're able to tease apart these affiliation motives and career motives, which oftentimes get pulled together. And so I think people just, when you think about a career goal or a weight loss goal, you tend to always look at this as an I statement. And what we're trying to show is that even though we see it as an I statement, it's an interpersonal statement implicitly in how we're acting with our social world. So these typologies are not perfect, and there are lots of ways that they can overlap and whatnot, but sort of, I think in terms of discrete interpersonal perception behaviors, they do diverge very nicely. But it's definitely something that we've talked about a lot. And we've also changed the names of how we call them probably 5 or 6 times because this sort of thing comes up. Because also when you're affiliating, you're also achieving. So sort of how the goal literature in social psych primes goals gets a bit confounded in here, which you'll see and hear about a little bit later in the talk. Okay, so in terms of the overarching hypotheses and predictions, what we're saying is that when we have these self-oriented goals, we're going to activate and build sparse networks, basically because when I have a self-oriented goals, my interpersonal perceptions are very evaluative. So I'm looking for specific things in other people. So what we would suggest in a real social group is that if I don't see those skills and traits in people in my immediate social group, I'm going to go and connect with another group in the network. So I'm willing to leave my immediate group to go find someone else who's able to enable that goal better than the people in my immediate network. So basically, you're making multiple connections with different groups in the network. You're becoming sort of the boundary spanning structural holes. So this is what we predict over time, that as you have more of a self-oriented orientation, you're going to make multiple connections, attain sort of this highly powerful network position. Affiliation goals, as I said on the last slide, they tend to have this rose-colored interpersonal perception. So I will date anyone when I have this goal activated, regardless of their skills and traits. So I just can't really see that and parse apart my social world based on these skills. And so what we're predicting in this case is that people are going to be staying within their immediate social circle. They're going to be reinforcing the network as opposed to reshaping it in order to obtain these goal-relevant outcomes. And so these types of network structures have been discussed a lot in the literature. So which one is better, which one is worse? And we're not saying one is better or worse, but what we're saying is that they're better and worse for different outcomes. And so this more sparser network has potential for more promotions. You're more powerful. You tend to be more innovative. Whereas the more dense network, you tend to have more social support, trust, fine-grained knowledge sharing. And what we're hoping to show is that these goals in the first place link into what we already know that's established in the social networks literature, so that you're creating these structures that are conducive to producing your long-term outcomes. So just to sort of show this another way, everyone has goals, and what we're predicting is that the more self-oriented versus affiliation-oriented they are, the more likely you are to activate and cultivate structures that tend to be more or less dense. And as we know from the literature, that these structures tend to be associated already with various types of goal outcomes. Any questions so far? So this might sound a little bit confusing, but hopefully through the studies, sort of you'll get a better idea of what we're talking about. So there are 4 empirical studies that I'm hoping to get through today. The first 3 are lab-based studies, kind of cute experiments, and the 4th study is a longitudinal network study. So just to demonstrate the causality that we're going for, so in study 1, we're doing a correlational study measuring goals and structure in concert with each other. Study 2, we prime goals and we look at network structure. Study 3, we take causality in the other direction. We prime structure and look at goals. And then study 4, we try to establish causality in this direction, so the goals that we're trying to achieve and the structure that we end up creating when we join a new network. So study 1 is the simple correlational study. And so we look at if goals that people self-generate, say that what they're trying to achieve over the next few months, can predict the density of their network. So we used a survey, and the very first thing we did was have them do the ego network generator, where they list 5 important people, and then we let them list any additional contacts, but the first 5 were what we were very interested in for the rest of the survey. Then we did individual difference scales to look at previous constructs like self-monitoring that have been important in network research. And then we randomized the order of the following 2 things, and there were no order effects. So we either asked for the density of the ties, so whether the alters knew each other, and then we had them do our goal-setting task that we use in our lab a lot. So we have them tell us what the goal they're trying to achieve, but not finish completely, is over the next 3 months. The goal is something that they've set themselves, so it's not something that their boss is telling them to do or their friend is telling them to do. It's something that they themselves want to achieve over the next few months. So we had lots of examples of goals. So people wanted to make more money. People were focused on taking care of an aging relative. People wanted to move houses, get a promotion, make new friends, move to a new town, etc. And we had coders code the goal on two dimensions. The first was how interpersonal versus individualistic the goal was. And then secondly, how affiliation-oriented versus achievement-oriented the goal was. And these were highly correlated, so we combined them into a scale. And the dependent variable was network density. So we used an online sample of employed adults in the United States, and we had a little under 200 people. And what we find is tentative support for the hypothesis. So with the goals that we coded that they generated, we were able to predict network density. So the more self-oriented the goals were, the less dense the network was. And this was the network that they generated right off the top of the survey. So they didn't have the goal listed and then generate their network, so we can't really establish causation in this study. Yep.
Is there a reason why you had 134 women out of 185?
Oh, so the sample tends to be female dominated, but they're all employed. So it's hard to say how employed they were, but they were full-time employees according to the survey. But women tend to be the dominant sample, even in lab studies. They just show up. You know, they're conscientious. So we try to balance it, but yeah. And we've run some of these studies with men only. When we had to use women only for one sub-study, we used men for another, and it tends to work. But just in this sample, we only got a few men. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so women tend to have denser networks in general. So study 1, we have the correlational evidence. So our effect is present in the data. And now we're trying to tease apart causality. So study 2, we're looking at priming goals and seeing about network structure. So goals are great that everybody seems to have goals, whether we acknowledge it or not. But we've also developed techniques that we can use to activate goals for fleeting moments in lab studies and use that to help us predict network structure. So study 2, we ask, can goals activate networks? And this causality is ranging from goals to network structure. And the design is a 3-goal design. So we have goal primes for achievement, affiliation, and control. And I'll talk about these more on the next few slides. And we used Duke undergraduate students. We had more than 20 per cell. So it's still a small sample, but we're trying to meet basic metrics. And the procedure is they first came in and did individual differences scales. And then we had these goal primes, and we used something called a scrambled sentence task, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And the important thing about this task is that it's explicit in terms of you're writing down words, but it's pretty implicit compared to other primes we could use. And so what we have a lot of problems with is these studies is that we use too explicit a prime, and then we activate a social category, which then as soon as you control for that, all the results go away. So then we use the ego network generator, and we confine them to list contacts within the Duke community so that people weren't listing their mom and dad. We had them list sort of roommates and classmates and friends. And our DV was ego network density, a continuous measure. So what is a scrambled sentence task? And so we tend to frame it as a filler task in a lot of our studies where we give people 5 words, 4 of which make a grammatically correct sentence. So we have this one said, what did he achieve? Or, yeah, what did he achieve? Then she relates with her, and then he wanted to conserve. So you get 20 of these, and you just sort of think, we say it's about your academic prowess. So if you can do these sentences, you're a really good student, and so people get all excited and they do it. But what we're actually doing is we're priming goals. And so in the achievement goal condition, we have 15 achievement-based words embedded in these sentences. In the affiliation goal, we have 15 affiliation words. And in the control condition, we have all neutral words. And so this has been used many times, and it's shown to affect behavior down the line.
In this example, is wanted not more of an achievement primer?
Which one?
Wanting something in the control variable?
Wanted.
You could want an achievement or an affiliate.
Yeah, so that's, he wanted to conserve. Maybe it's not the best example of the control prime, but they tend to be all neutral words. So, but that's a good point. And so study 2, we also look for these effects via moderation, because these primes have to be implicit enough that they're not activating categories, but they tend to be very general. And since people always have these goals juggling around in their heads, that we predict our effects via moderation. So we have our Duke undergrads. I'm sure if you've ever read Gawker or any national news, you know that we have a bit of a reputation for doing some wild things. They tend to be work hard, party hard undergrads. And so we use these orientations, these goal orientations in these studies. So the first is looking at academic goal commitment, how committed they are to achieving these academic outcomes. And then we also looked at social goal commitment. So college is about making these lifelong friendships. It's not just about doing well in class. And we predict that moderators influence the response to primes. And so when you're primed with this broad achievement goal, that if you have a high academic commitment, that you will decrease your network. Activated networks will be significantly less dense. And if you have these social goal commitments, when you're primed with this affiliation goal, that your network density will be significantly higher than if you have a lower social commitment. So when we did these analyses, we obviously did them properly. We coded them. We ran regressions and whatnot. But in terms of displaying the results for simplicity's sake, we're showing you median splits up here. And so on this slide, we're looking at academic commitment. We have our 2 goal primes. We just didn't put the control condition on the slides for ease of interpretation. And then we're looking at how dense people's networks are. And so what we're predicting with academic commitment is that this is going to affect how people respond to these achievement goal primes. And so we see in the affiliation goal that how much you value your academics isn't really significantly affecting how you respond to this prime and activate your network. But when you're primed with an achievement goal, we find what we were expecting. So high academic achievement leads to the cognitive activation of significantly less dense networks. So networks that tend to promote academic achievement are what's being activated when this is important to you and this goal is being primed to you in the lab. In this slide, we're looking at social goal commitment as predicting how people respond to these goal primes. And what we're expecting is that this effect is going to be seen when we prime affiliation goals. So when you prime an affiliation goal and you have this tendency already, you're going to activate much denser networks than you would otherwise. And we see there's no effect when we prime achievement goals with this affiliation commitment. But we find here what we were expecting. So having a very high commitment to social goals, to partying, to having a good time at university shows that when you're primed with this goal, you're going to activate networks that are much denser than when that goal isn't really important to you in the first place. So any questions? Yeah. It was just the simple, we had the 5 contacts and then the ratings of closeness between each of the ties. The standard. Yeah. By the ego. So this is all ego network data. So that's problematic because when I also have an affiliation goal, I might just see affiliation everywhere and think people that maybe aren't connected are connected. And so that's a definite limitation with this method. But we have field data to try to replicate this as well. So yeah, it's all the alters perception in these studies. Any other questions? Okay, so just in terms of where we've been, where we're going, so study 1 with the survey with correlational data. And this study, we primed goals to see how people activated their social networks. And in study 3, we're taking causality in the opposite direction. And so we've sort of had this literature that's very established in showing that network structures predict these types of goals. So this is almost a manipulation check of what's been established for the past 50 years, but we're doing it in a slightly different way. And so in this experiment, we're priming networks and looking at whether people think they're better or worse at achieving different types of goals when these network primes are active. And so this had 3 conditions as well, where we primed network structure. We had a dense network, a sparse network, or a control network where we didn't guide people through their ego network generation. And we used primes that Tanya talked about in her talk, where we basically have people activate a subset of their social network, and I'm going to describe those on the next slide. And the dependent variable is success at achieving various goal outcomes. And I'm going to talk about this in 2 slides from now. We had them just rate whether they think they could do various tasks in their social world or not. And we used a within subjects repeated measures ANOVA to increase our power in our analyses. So how did we prime these networks? So everyone started off with the very first thing. So saying, please name one person who you consider to be important in your life and write their initials here. In the control condition, we had them do this 5 times to generate any network that they would sort of naturally activate at that moment in time. In the dense network, we'd say now name a second person who's also important in your life and knows person 1 and write their initials here. Then name a third person who knows person 1 and person 2 so that they, for 5 iterations, so that they generate a fully connected 5-person ego network. In the sparse prime, we have them generate a 5-person star network. So name a second person who doesn't know person 1, a third person who doesn't know person 1 and person 2, so that they name 5 people who are not connected at all in their social worlds. And we use this to predict how people feel about achieving various goals. And so what kind of goals do we ask them about? So we divided up the goals that we asked in terms of self-oriented goals and affiliation-oriented goals. So in terms of the self-oriented goals, we first asked whether they think they could get a promotion at work. This is a very classic finding, strength of weak ties. I could get a promotion, I could get a new job. Then we asked whether they could be recognized as a top performer in their organization. Then sort of more the goal that tends to come up a lot when we ask people in surveys that most people, especially women, would like to lose weight, another self-oriented goal. And then we have a few more menial goals that are self-oriented but not that high level. So I could get a ride to the doctor when I'm sick. I could get someone to pick me up if my car broke down. So not sort of these overarching big goals, but things that are important in life. And then our affiliation-oriented goals sort of take the same pattern. We have a high-level goal about developing a better relationship with your coworkers. And then we ask if they could throw a fun dinner party, have a meaningful conversation with a stranger on an airplane. So tasks that have nothing to do with the network that they generated as well. And if you could find someone to go to the movies with you at the last minute. And so what we're predicting is that the primes that you have, whether you're thinking of a tightly connected network or a network where no one knows each other, should affect how people implicitly feel that they could achieve various things in life. And so we have the 3 primes along the bottom of the screen, and we're measuring perceived goal achievement. And what we find in the sparse condition is that when you've been primed with a network where nobody knows each other, you think that you're better at doing things such as getting a promotion, being recognized as a top performer in the organization, which we believe sort of experimentally replicates some of the classic network structural to outcome findings. In the dense network condition, we find the opposite pattern. And so when you're primed with this dense network, you think that you're not so good at getting a promotion, but you'd be really good at having a conversation on an airplane with a stranger, so that you'd all of a sudden be a bit better at achieving your affiliation goals. And so the control condition is kind of interesting, because this is what happens in all my studies. The control condition always looks like the sparse network for some reason, We can't quite figure out why it always looks like the sparse condition, but just with the samples that we tend to use, they always replicate the sparse network condition in all the studies. So maybe it probably has to do with the goals that people have or just their general orientation. They tend to be probably achievement-oriented. It's a paid subject pool, so they just really want to make money. So here we have some more initial support for our hypotheses, but going in the opposite causal direction. So sparse network primes, you feel better at doing these self-oriented goals. Dense network primes, you feel better at doing more affiliation-oriented goals. And we have this mediated by the tie closeness, so how close you feel to people in your network mediates this relationship. So just to quickly summarize where we've been. So we have our correlational evidence showing that this effect is present. Then we have causality going from goals to network structure. Then we reverse causality. We prime networks. Yeah.
So that's that. How will you respond to criticism that says, is that last experiment that you did really showing network structure influencing goal, or is it showing priming of network structure influencing goal?
It's priming of network structure, yes. And so we're basically activating a specific part of the network is how we would frame it. And that thinking about focusing on that part of the network influences these goal outcomes.
But on this slide, priming part is not highlighted here. It makes it sound like it's network structure that's influencing.
Okay, yeah, that's true, priming. Okay, thank you. So these studies, we use small samples, we use experimental methods, so obviously how long-standing can these effects be? And so instead of using that as a limitation, we've decided to test for this in a real-world data set. And so we have longitudinal data of newly forming networks where we were able to measure people's goals before they met anyone in their network and use those to predict their network structure and positions 1 month into their social relationships. So study 4 looks at goals in newly forming networks. Our population was an incoming class of MBA students, and there were 6 sections which we used as the definition for our network, as it's been done in other studies on MBAs and social networks. Our data collection occurred in 2 main waves. When they were offered admission to the program and they accepted, they received a survey from the school, and we were allowed to add some questions to the survey. And basically what we asked was, what are you trying to achieve? We asked them a whole bunch of items, and then we asked them specifically about different types of goals, how important it was for you to, say, get an education or have a lot of fun while you're taking 2 years off of work. And then we had data collection in August 2011, where in class, as part of their social networks day and their introductory course, they filled out a network generator. And we had 100% participation in that, as it was required by the class. However, things get a little hairy when we had to consent people into this study. So we had to reverse consent our people into to the data set. And so this is a great example of the IRB being very helpful in that we were allowed to use 100% of the network to calculate the network scores, but we were only allowed to use the consenters in our regression. So when someone consented to this study, their network scores were based on the entire network, but we just couldn't put everybody into the regression because only about half of the MBAs consented to the research. So in terms of what we measured, in the pre-survey, when they had selected Duke as their desired MBA program, we asked about the importance and commitment to various goals. So we asked about their academic goals, career goals, physical health, and social goals. And we decided to fixate on career and social goals as the ones that paralleled our self-oriented goals versus our affiliation-oriented goals. And these goals don't correlate highly or at all. And not surprisingly, the academic goals weren't extremely strong in our sample. So they're mostly there to get a job and to make friends. And so that was the focus of them coming to the MBA program. Then we had a self-monitoring scale to replicate and extend previous research. And then we had our social network task that we did in class. We used the friendship network, and we used the list method. So they were allowed to nominate people in their network, in their section, who they considered to be friends, and vice versa. So in terms of our dependent measures, we were able to take the whole 100% networks and run them through UCINet. The first thing we calculated was Freeman betweenness centrality, which is a standardized measure. And if you're not familiar with this measure, it's whether I have 2 points in a network and I go and take the shortest path between them, the probability that I will fall on the shortest path between 2 people. So if you look up on the screen, in the middle of that graph up there are the blue dots, and those are the people who tend to have the highest Freeman betweenness centrality. So the people who are often on the shortest path between any 2 points in a network. And that's been shown to be a good predictor of power, and it's been used in previous research. We also ran the structural holes routine, and so what this is that it takes the entire network and it breaks it down to the ego network level. And so it addresses the concern that our previous studies have all the alter relationships being at the mercy of the participant. So this way we can verify the alter by alter relationships with people who are actually the alters. And so we use this measure because we've been using it in the first 3 studies of this talk. Any questions? Okay. So we used OLS. We followed the same procedures as Martin Kildoff and his colleagues that they used when they predicted self-monitoring as predicting network structure. So the first thing we did is we put in our controls, and we didn't find much in terms of predicting network centrality. Then in Model 2, we added self-monitoring. And what we see here is that we replicate the findings of Martin Kildoff, that high self-monitors tend to obtain these highly central, powerful network positions. And then we added in our 4 goal measures individually. And we also just, we multiplied all of our controls with all of our goals, and we didn't find interactions there. So we just are showing the overall regression models. And in this step, what we have is that we continue to replicate the self-monitoring work, and we significantly add variance to the model. But as we predicted, people with high career goals that are very salient obtained higher, more powerful network positions, whereas people who had these social goals activated obtained significantly less powerful network positions. And so now the question that everybody asks is, what if I want both? I want to have a good career and a good social life. What happens when both of these goals are high in our participants? What we find, not surprisingly, when you think about it, is that they lose the benefits of having this career motivation here. So when you want to have a good career and a very strong social relationship and make these big connections, that they don't obtain highly powerful network positions again. So it's when the career goal is functioning independently of these social goals that they tend to obtain these highly powerful network positions that have been shown to affect career success in the long run. So we use the density measure, where we're looking specifically at the ego network to see if we could replicate our previous studies. And just to show you the overall model, we again find the same interaction effects. So density and Freeman betweenness centrality are conceptually opposite. So having high density means having low betweenness centrality. So that's why the signs are different, opposite from each other. And we find this interaction effect again, and we replicate the career goal finding that having these career goals active leads to having significantly less dense networks, whereas having both goals active attenuates this effect, and you get sort of stuck in a clique, and you don't obtain these powerful network positions.
Any idea why you don't have significant effect on social goals?
No. And we also don't replicate the self-monitoring effects with just density. And so this has been another perplexing thing in all of my studies. I don't replicate self-monitoring with density measures, but only with Freeman betweenness centrality. And so I don't really know why, to be honest. It's problematic.
Get self-monitoring with density?
No.
No.
But they imply it.
Density and betweenness are opposite, but
they're not,
opposite,
yeah.
Right?
They're negatively correlated, but they're not perfectly correlated. And I think so something in how they're using the ties of ties, I think, is coming into play here.
But the density, you're only looking at your direct ones.
Mm-hmm.
You're seeing if you are between
Two
people
people.
directly connected to you.
Yeah.
That is, they're not connecting each other.
Yeah.
While
Betweenness
says that you could be connecting people who are themselves
Yeah.
removed.
Yeah. And so I think that's what's happening. It's the broker by tie things are something that self-monitors are good at picking up on and perceiving in networks. And that would be my hypothesis, but we don't know why. Tanya?
So the data is really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think this goes back to the very first question
Yeah.
that Anush asked.
Yeah.
What does it mean, self-related goals? So it makes perfect sense to me,
Mhm.
self-related goals around promotion
Mhm.
that you see your effects. Because they're very strategic players, and they're acting, they're not thinking about, let me hang out with who I want to hang out with. They're being very strategic.
Yeah.
Selection. But the goals, such as I want to lose weight.
Why is this happening?
Yeah. How do you put that? How do you group those kinds of goals in? On one set of goals are about social power, getting things relative to other people, maybe using other people as a means to get opportunities.
So I think you're asking an even more fundamental question is whether this is a conscious or unconscious process. So when I'm having my promotion goal, I could consciously be aware that I'm picking the secretaries and the boss and the this and the that. And I think when we've studied this in other domains, such as weight loss, we've characterized this as an implicit process. And so when I'm trying to lose weight, I'm picking specific people. So I'm not going to go out with the person that always wants to go to, TGI Fridays or something like that. So I think there is this evaluative approach that's coming in how we're perceiving our social others. And so that would be how I would parallel weight loss goals with promotion goals. And I think that a lot of times we can talk about, especially in the workplace, is this being a very strategic self-monitoring thing to do. I'm going to pick this person because of that. I think we're trying to characterize this as more of an implicit thing.
I would also throw in Machiavellianism next time.
Okay.
That is what is strategic interaction measure. Maybe even nicer than self-monitoring and getting
So in Grania's data, she's never found Machiavellianism. So that's another thing that we've talked about a lot as a lab, that Machiavellianism seems to fit the strategic thing, but I think it's more strategic in terms of adaptive. That's how I would characterize it, is that I'm not using a person, but I'm being adaptive in my needs and who I'm surrounding myself with. So she's never found Mach in her work. Yeah, it's very interesting because this research comes across as very Machiavellianism, that I'm sort of doing this and I'm cutting ties with people who are, dead to me. But, I think it's more of an implicit process that is coming out here. So does that answer your question? Do you have a question? Okay.
I'm a little puzzled with your use of betweenness and density, given your original example that the goal will decide who you're going to have lunch with, or with the boss or something. That would determine your degree as an individual, but not necessarily your betweenness score or your density in the network. So,
Okay.
So basically, are you saying that you don't necessarily pick the boss, but you pick the person who has additional ties? How is these higher structured?
So I guess the lunch example was simplistic, but hopefully I was trying to get across is over time, because you're making these connections, you're creating this network. And so actually with degree, I think the affiliation-oriented goals lead you to have higher out degree, at least. You're sort of giving ties to a lot of people, and we find that in our data most of the time. And so I think it's a bit more than just having a big network. It's who you're choosing in your degree outreaching. Does that make sense?
Could I push that a little bit further,
Yeah.
Roger's question? It sounds to me that if you go back even to the so-called simplistic example, that what if you stayed with degrees instead of just looking at the number of ties, you came up with some measure of diversity? That is, you had some attributes of the alters, and you see whether you had a greater amount of diversity in your immediate network.
Yeah.
Rather than betweenness, which is in a sense more abstract. So the relationship that you show between, that people who want to achieve goals and betweenness, that's pretty well documented. That happens. Maybe not so much documented longitudinally as you do here, but that's intuitively. But the rationale that you provide provided,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what, if I understand Roger's question, the rationality provided was not so much for betweenness as much as may have been for diversity.
Diversity.
And the extent to which that might have been, that it helped you get your goals because you're getting different kinds of information.
Mm-hmm. And from my understanding of sort of, not more so density, is that different, lower density gives you more unique information. So it's an implicit process. And so I have all the data of sort of the demographic. And so what we've had problems with in the experimental studies is we've activated social categories. And so as soon as we control for that, it all goes away. And so the study 2 that I presented, we've run so many times. And as soon as we use a prime that's a little too explicit, everyone names their coworkers, and then everyone names their family. And so we've been really struggling experimentally to control for those while sort of letting the process happen a bit more naturalistically. But we can talk about this some more. So I have 5 minutes left. I want to quickly finish up. So the interaction of the goals we think is really interesting. And we don't know a lot as psychologists about how people pursue multiple goals. Everyone says they have lots of goals that we're trying to pursue. But what we're showing is that when we have just this one career goal active, we're getting these benefits of the network. When both are active and committed too highly, we're not obtaining these benefits that we would have wanted to get with the career goal. And we don't have any potential mechanisms, but we sort of are chalking this up to the means of the goals are conflicting with each other. So a good example of this is that if you have a romantic goal and you want to lose weight, it's really good to go work out with your significant other. It's not good to go drinking with them, because if you're working out together, sort of everything's going in this direction. If you're going drinking together, there's a conflict in how you're achieving both of your goals. And so we think that this is sort of like the lunch example. The people who have both goals active are not sort of seeking diversity in lunch mates as much as the people who have this strong career goal that are just consistently making connections with other people. So in terms of the study conclusions and looking at goals predicting network structure, we have correlational evidence in study 1. Study 2, we have priming goals to seeing what networks they generate. Study 3, we look at primed networks and seeing how that influences perceived goal outcomes. And in study 4, we have longitudinal field data. And so we're taking this optimistically as some tentative support for our hypothesis that people are building these social worlds in response to the goals that they're trying to achieve. In terms of contributions and implications, we think that this is adding to the psychological antecedents of network literature in 2 distinct ways. The first is a compelling story behind network ties. And so why am I not making ties with everyone who shares my demographic information? So maybe I'm seeing or looking to certain ties for certain things that aren't measurable in specific gender and population variables. The second thing is that we feel like this and the social capital activation work is pushing beyond individual differences. And so with individual differences, you're able to find between-person variance, but not a lot of within-person variance, just by the definition of things being stable traits. And so we can sort of hope to look how these processes play out over time in our networks. We also think that we're shedding a little bit of light on this agency issue in social networks. So how do people take advantage of opportunities? What's pushing them to even create their network positions? And it addresses a few debates in the organizational literature about what is a good network structure. And so we say that they're both good for different things. In terms of practical applications, we talked about this a little bit. How do we pursue multiple goals in terms of our networks? And what we have some evidence for is that it's best to sort of stick to one goal and not confuse yourself, especially if the goal means are conflicting. In terms of future research, what I really am hoping to do is look at more comprehensive longitudinal network data. So anyone who is in the social sciences, especially people who do experimental work, know that there's a bit of a crisis brewing in terms of the replication. There are projects to replicate the top 4 major journals. There's been a lot of data fudging. And what I think is really powerful about network data is that we can tease apart these mechanisms in the lab, but then we can see if they're actually real replicable effects in the real world. And so this is what the direction I'd like to push my research in. Another interesting thing that I have data for, but I just haven't gotten around to testing with all my teaching and whatnot, is something about goal homophily. So whether we match in our motivations or look for complementary other people. So if everyone with a social goal run an ergom and they come together, or whether they're sort of complementarity processes going together. And of course, multi-level goals. So we're looking at individualistic goals and friendship networks. People work for organizations, and they have goals there. They're also on teams, and teams have their own goals. And then organizations have overarching goals themselves. So this nesting of goals within individuals, teams, and organizations, I think, is a really interesting direction. And so in the spirit of this talk, so I didn't achieve this by myself, but I built up my social network to help me move me along. I wanted to just thank my social network who've been really instrumental and pushed me forward in these ideas. So if you have any more questions, I'd love to answer them. But thank you.
The fact that you had to study 3 in the other direction means you're really arguing that it's a coevolution between goals and networks. Right?
Yes.
When I kept hearing your talk for the longest time, I kept thinking you were making the case more for, as you started out, the antecedents, that's goals-shaped networks. Mm-hmm. But your studies are arguing, at least study 3 argues, that it can also go in the other direction.
Yes. Right? Well, I think it's bi-directional thing in that we've focused on one direction, and that in my future ideal world, we could look at whether you have these goals, whether these MBAs activated these networks, and how many job offers they had to see if there can be some sort of mediating mechanism through the network. So the networks are a means. And study 3, I think, just was a confirmation of our goal type, so that these 2 primes were validating how we thought goals were functioning. So it was almost like a manipulation check, but I think it's a cool manipulation check in terms of the methods that we were using.
Do you think that the networks could change your goals? That
yes.
You start out being much more achievement-oriented, but then you decide to hang out with people who tell you what a good time is.
So I think especially people with affiliation goals, and some other work I have, they sort of just catch people's goals. So a good way to affiliate with someone is to share their goal and be instrumental to it. And so whether it's affiliation goals or this need to belong as more of a trait thing, that's a good way you catch the goals. And I'm also interested, I have other data as to whether sort of in terms of goal setting, which is a very big organizational process, how we use social comparisons to set our goals. So if I look when I'm feeling bad about myself, if I look to Tanya or if I look to my mother to set my goals, and that kind of a dynamic process of how you look to your networks to set a level of reference for your future self.
What about the more like content factors in the network? Because I can imagine that the bidirectional effect also stems from the fact that I go have lunch with my boss, and my boss he's my boss, who might stimulate me to achieve my personal goals. Whereas my friends, if I go out to the club, they tend to pursue me to drink more and hang out with them more, so I become more sociable. And
but it's an affiliation goal. So if that's what you have, then they're fulfilling it.
Yes.
Yes. Is that?
Yeah. No. So I can imagine that, as said, like it will always be a correlation between the two, and maybe there are underlying factors that form causality. I don't know.
Well, I think what my overarching goal is to say that causality can go the other direction too. And so I think it's going to be a bidirectional process, but we've just really neglected one direction of the process so far. And so I'm not saying this is always the direction it's going in, but that it can go in this direction every once in a while, at least. Yeah. Yeah. So.
Great. Well, thank
you.
Again. Very, very nice.
Thank you.